Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with our global multi-stakeholder community, representing national and local governments, international policymakers, civil society, NGOs, the ICT industry, as well as other relevant organizations and institutes.
Hello, I'm your host Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Stephen Ibaraki. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Hey, it's a real pleasure to be here. You're a real change maker, Fritz. So you're definitely impacting the world.
Hey, Stephen, thank you so much. And allow me to introduce Stephen for the people who do not know Stephen. Well, you live in Canada. You're a social entrepreneur, a futurologist, venture capitalist, the chair of Reds Capital. And you've been in the IT industry for well over 50 years. Now, not many people can make that claim. And you have been recognized for your work. So you have Global Lifetime Achievement Awards, Innovation Awards, recognition. Microsoft has given you 18 global awards. So you must do something very good. Well, you write for Forbes, and actually you were already a speaker at the last summit on accountability in the Peace Palace behind me. And you're also one of the founders of ITU's AI for Good Global Top Summit. So these are a couple of highlights of your background, Stephen. And first of all, 50 years in information technology, how have you seen the world change from when you started out and what it is today? And then specifically with keeping the whole accountability question in mind.
You know, it's really interesting in that there was not that much technology engagement when I first started out, right? People were really more concerned about their day-to-day lives and physically making a living and building some kind of ecosystem for themselves so they could sustain themselves and their family. Now, you see technology everywhere. In fact, it's so seamless, you don't even know it's there. You know, for example, when you do a search online, or when you're using social media, or when you're watching television, or when you're dealing with your appliances, there's all sorts of tech and AI and other kinds of technology all built in. Your car is just really, it's a platform. It's a technology platform you're driving, right? It's not a car. So it's everywhere. So that's the major change, and the acceleration of change is so very much on the steep curve. And I use this as sort of a meta or an example. I say, you know, imagine there's some kind of species got into your pond and it's doubling every day. So, you know, when it's one plant and then goes to 2 and then 4 or 8, 16, 32, you don't notice it. But when it's a quarter full of this particular plant, then you start noticing it. And then the next day it's half full, the next day it's full. We're in that quarter, half full stage of the acceleration. And some people have called this the fourth industrial revolution, from the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. And Japan came out with something called Society 5.0. And a society you're part of called KNVI has something called Smart Humanity. That's its pervasive everything we do. And then because of that, there's this whole aspect of accountability. What does it mean to the consumer? What does it mean to companies? What does it mean to our families and our children? What does it mean to governments and policy and UN agencies and so on? All of these factors now you have to consider because the impact it's having.
True, but you take accountability now into the equation, but it's not always in the discussion when you start off, because I mean, we both are part of the AI for Good Global Summit, which is now owned by ITU. Well, maybe before I ask my question, can you introduce us? How did that happen? How did that start?
You know, I've always been involved with the UN, and for example, even prior to that in the Millennium Goals. And but what was interesting when the Millennium Goals were established in 2000, really technology wasn't a factor. So between 2000 and 2015, where the Sustainable Development Goals were established, they didn't the UN didn't even consider things like the impact of technology, the internet, mobile technology, AI, none of that. When they just didn't see it. So you notice with the SDGs, which came out in 2015, there's very much a recognition that technology is as a driver. But even early on, even prior to 2000, there was this idea that there was some accountability in some form. In other words, what is the impact is it going to have? But it wasn't really codified until, I would say, past, when the SDGs came out, then people started thinking of it in a more concrete way. So then your question is, how did the AI for Good Summit come out? Well, prior to 2010, I was mentioning that technology has to be a much bigger factor. In fact, even prior to 2000, I was indicating that technology, you have to factor that in and the impact it's going to have. And impact also means accountability. And then I did presentations throughout these different time periods, including prior to the founding of the UN ITU, AI for a Good Global Summit. So where I was talking about the impact of technology, and then how did this come about? I had a meeting with some of the leaders, and I mentioned that AI is going to be much bigger than what you're seeing now, right? Because you're talking 2016, early 2016. So, and it's going to be so pervasive, it's going to have an impact and maybe even not even in obvious ways. And I said, this has to be addressed from a sustainability standpoint. So that conversation became the, excuse me, the UN ITU AI for Good Global Summit. So there was elements of accountability, but very much tied into the SDGs, right? Because the SDGs do have accountability baked into them.
Yeah, but it wasn't a topic explicitly on the agenda. I mean, I do agree it was implicit referring to the SDGs, but over the years, that conference started to grow and grow. I was actually pleasantly surprised that it's only in the last year when we had the physical summit that all of a sudden people realized, hey, we really need to address accountability. So have it in your face, because otherwise this technology might actually take us for a ride.
It's interesting that in the lead up to the first summit in 2016, I was asked to convene an entire day at the World Telecom Assembly. They have this sort of World Assembly led by the UNITU. And in that entire day, I had a session, half-day session on financial services and really what's happening and the impact of technology. And another half a day was on AI and the impact it's what's going to have. But we did talk about the accountability aspects, the ethical principle aspects. We did address some of those. When we looked at the AI for Good First Summit, you would see some of that embedded in the, the parallel sessions that were happening and things like that. And so there is some baking of that, including prior to 2018, for example, or 2019, even with the keynote with Roger Penrose, which I chaired and moderated, we talked about some of the bigger implications of it from a human being standpoint and consciousness and what does this mean? So maybe not in an overt way in a plenary session so much, but really it was being talked about in the different sessions from the very first summit, which I believe was June of 2017, to the very last physical summit, which was in May of 2019. And then, of course, in the daily programming that's coming out. And also in the 6+ working groups, they call them focus groups, which are doing tangible work on addressing the idea of how can we use AI to find solutions and standards against sustainable development goals. And accountability is baked into all of those programs. So.
Good. Now that's good to hear, and good to be reminded of that. Now, slightly different topic here, because this is an event where I would say the people who really know about what's happening about technology, they come together. So it's an in-crowd of, I would say, not preaching to the converted, but people who know this is going to have a huge impact. In your assessment, does Joe public, the general public, are they aware enough of what's happening at the moment?
You know, it's an interesting question, because really there's layers to this. Even in business, there was a study out, I believe from MIT, even this year, indicating that maybe the penetration in enterprises across all of the aspects of an enterprise was maybe something like 13% of large businesses, right? And then if you look at McKinsey, they're indicating that maybe the adoption is 50%. And if you look at the World Economic Forum, the Future of Jobs report, which came out last year, they're indicating, well, maybe by 2025, it'd be somewhere in the 80 percentile. So even within businesses, the scaling is not happening yet, right? And the reason is things like accountability and the ethical principles. There's this aspect of how do you scale it across the enterprise? So there's that layer, even on the business side. Small and medium-sized businesses, low adoption, even though it's being used and embedded in many of the things they do. They're not overtly employing it. Now let's go one layer or to another layer. It's not necessarily down, but just another layer. You have this layer of UN agencies and so on. This idea of AI and the importance of it probably came into the forefront, I would say, in 2014, 2015, sort of this idea, but really not in a concrete, sort of more concerted effort, I would say. I would say the UNITU is the one that really did it in a concerted way, and that conversation starting even before 2016, but really going into something useful in 2016, and then the lead up to the first summit. And then you have this layer of research organizations and so on. They've been looking at this aspect of AI and the impact it's going to have, because I'm on the board, one of the boards of the ACM. You were part of that program, and of course it's always been embedded in some way. Even during the winter, the sort of the idea of the AI winter, there were still some conversations, of course, that accelerated post 2000, when machine learning became more and more important, leading up to Jeffrey Hinton and ImageNet, and 2011, 2012, you see this much more rapid acceleration. But then you get to the consumer level. I would say by and large, consumers are aware that it's there, but they're not really conscious of how it's there, other than maybe press releases, things like facial recognition and maybe the impact that's going to have, or their phone and data privacy, or you see some of the controversy or some of the discussions associated with social media and the amplification of messages and things like that, leading to maybe swings in sentiment amongst the population, where you get this group think happening. So, but I would say still the majority of the population don't really have a full spectrum of all of the accountability aspects and what that means, other than some of these things that they see in the news. However, I believe that will change in the next 2 to 3 years, and it's because you're seeing the major tech companies addressing the European Union, or they're addressing the US government, or you see these reports coming from different entities indicating the impact it's going to have, including on the consumer. And then what are some of the aspects the consumers have to be aware of as this augments people, maybe affects them on their job. If you work in a bank, for example, there's a lot of automation occurring, right? A lot of online banking and so on, fraud detection. I mean, how many people get some kind of message maybe once a year or more that there's some kind of alert coming? Well, that's driven by some kind of machine learning or AI system of some sort. So people are seeing it on the periphery. So on your question though, do they have this sort of really innate sort of feeling of, and we'll do something about it? That's not there yet. But I think it will happen in the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay, so that's in the next 2 to 3 years. Now, I also know, so as a general public, probably in the next 2 to 3 years, but I also know that you talk to global CEO communities and help them with their journey. To what extent are they aware? Because these are the people in control of a lot of big organizations, which we buy from and which we use. How aware are they of what's happening? And how do they address the question of accountability?
The very large, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, they definitely are intimately aware of the aspects of accountability and specifically AI and the impact it's going to have. They're very conscious on the impact it's going to have on the consumer. They very much want to address the accountability aspects. And so you'll see them publicly coming out with programs like we are addressing, data equity and bias and so on. And they've developed their own standards, and they're a part of these standards groups as well, entering these conversations. They're very much following that. Let me give you one example. Microsoft has something called Microsoft AI Business School, and they have this ethical aspect as part of that education for senior business leaders who want to say, there's AI, now how can I use it, right? So you're seeing the big tech companies coming out with pronouncements or programs to address this accountability issue. I don't see any large CEO, a company CEO, not addressing it in some way and thinking about it very deeply. So, and even Fritz, you were part of a community of 100 CEOs for a private summit, and I used to engage with them daily, but on this FinTech Ideas Festival.
Yes.
And actually, ethical aspects or the accountability aspects were even discussed when I was first engaged with this community back in 2015, and then the planning in 2016. And we were part of these monthly programs and sort of mini summits and helping with their working groups, and then their major invitation only summit, the first one held in January 2017. But this idea of accountability was even discussed then, and the impact it was going to have on their workforce and then on the broader consumer marketplace. But now you're seeing it much more public rather than sort of these private conversations.
True, so true. No, and that's very good to share that lesson, you could say, out in public, that because what my take is from what you're sharing with us is that be assured the leadership is already thinking about this and taking this to account. So in 2-3 years, when this is going to, well, hopefully going to be a general topic, that at least the people we need to trust are already taking this on board and hopefully have thought about how we're going to manage this.
Yeah, in fact, what's happening is that, accountability from an ethical framework standpoint, which covers really every aspect of things from accountability, the frameworks and the principles, which have been around for some time, including code of ethics, which have been around for decades, they've gone from principles to being operationalized. And I would say that work really accelerated in a concrete way from 2019 with ISO standards, with I4ADA standards, including work with the UN ITU and some of the different programs they're using as well. You have the World Economic Forum, and they've created groups with this. There's even this, there's your work that you've been doing for a number of years. And even things like the Responsible AI Institute and working with the World Economic Forum to operationalize and create tools that you can use and things like that, right? Together with seeing if they can produce some kind of standards that everybody agree upon. And then you have the European Union and the European Commission this year saying, we are going to regulate it. We're going to actually have policies and laws around this. And they even put out some kind of, a draft so that people could address it. Some people say it's too general. Other people saying it's too confining. So, there's a lot of dialogue, but they came out and did it, right? Yeah. Just like they did on the data privacy side. So I would say the European Union is leading that conversation. And countries are looking at that, though other regions have put out programs like Canada, Australia, Singapore, and others, besides the nonprofits like the ISO people or standards organizations like the UN ITU or the IEEE or the HCM with their code of ethics, which they updated recently. And then, of course, it's being somewhat adopted and then put into this international federation, called the International Federation for Information Processing. They have their own code of ethics, but at its core, it's the ACM code of ethics, all of which is saying, let's look at at some case studies and useful techniques that we can use to sort of embed accountability in the work that we're doing, right? So that's the operationalization part. That is going to continue to grow, by the way. It's not going to decrease.
No, I definitely agree. Assume that that's going to grow. But you've just mentioned a couple of instruments we can use today to maintain accountabilities, like the code of ethics, like the rules and regulations. However, there's some people out there who still claim that that's not enough because technology is developing so fast that the legal and regulatory framework cannot keep up with that. So we need to look at other solutions. What's your take on that? Is that too negative or too skeptical, or is it something we have to, is that a concern?
You know, that's why you have the Responsible AI Institute, which is a nonprofit. They've got a trust index tool already. And so you're having different nonprofit organizations working within this big government-led programs, like the OECD has a program, the European Union has a program, the US is looking at this as well. So you're seeing the individual members of these more, policy-based programs already putting out tools, so you don't have to wait. It's something you can employ today, and you can participate. They're open programs, so you can participate in them right now. So even though it takes longer for the policies and the bylaws, or as you say, the regulations to come, to be widely adopted, you're having these organizations step in and saying, you know what, we're going to offer tools now, so you can start using this now. And we're participating in the bigger programs as well.
Brings me to the next topic, Stephen. You talk about organizations who offer frameworks, who should be at the table. Who, in your mind, should be at the table to make certain that we deal with this whole issue properly?
Well, I believe, UNESCO has done enormous work in looking at all of the sort of major frameworks and principles out there, trying to harmonize that, and then come out with some I would say collected aggregate standard in a way that people can look at. The World Economic Forum is also driving this. And you'll see these different players all at the same table, even on the Responsible AI Institute, all the same players are there as well. You'll see them contributing to that. Singapore has come out with a I would say an operational framework that you could use across governments or business. Canada has done this, Australia. So, there's concrete examples. I'm a contributor to Forbes and actually wrote an article a few months ago, where what I tried to do was cover what was happening and then examples that you could follow, and the specific examples of where they would have something you could actually use today. And part of that article was this Microsoft AI business goal, where they're trying to address it for executives, right? So.
Okay, now you've mentioned a couple of times that organization Microsoft and the big tech firms are at the table, but I see the general public becoming more and more skeptical about these big companies. So how can we control, how can we manage that narrative, that thinking process?
Well, you're part of that conversation, right?
True,
because you're not a big tech company. You're a facilitator, right? You're a nonprofit working to bring the different communities to the table and say, let's work together. So you're definitely an important part of this program. The World Economic Forum is trying to do the same thing. They're bringing UN and NGOs and corporates all together at the table as well. UNESCO is doing the same thing. So there are facilitation platforms out there, facilitation communities, where it ensures that it's open, so anybody can participate. You just raise your hand and say, I'm going to show up to your meetings, and you can participate. You can even take a leadership role.
That's true. No, you've actually already answered a question I didn't ask yet, and that is, how can the Institute for Accountability help in this global discussion? And I think I assume that you just actually already answered that question for us. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Every time you put out an announcement, show up, participate, right? Watch your video series, right? Your interview series, things like that. So.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're almost at the end of this session, Stephen. So are there any takeaways you have for the audience on what they need to think about or maybe what are you thinking? Are you optimistic? Are we going to get a handle on this, or are you concerned?
You know, we're going to get somewhat of a handle on it, but we can't control all the variables, right? So,
Yeah.
and if you want to, as an audience, if you want to start engaging, follow your work, Fritz. You're doing wonderful work. KNVI has been putting on a number of books. They have one on smart humanity. It's available. Some of them are free. Others you may have to pay a bit for them, but I recommend engaging with that group. IFIP is putting out quite a bit of material in this area. That's International Federation of Information Processing,
That's indeed true.
IEEE, ACM, UNITU has daily programming.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of forums that you can engage with. And Fritz, because you're facilitating all these conversations in different ways, when I attended your last event, your physical event, I mean, UNESCO was there, right?
Yeah.
UNITU was represented. You saw CEOs represented, governments were represented. You had all the players there, so.
Great. Okay, well, keep on the good work. And also this video will help with getting the message out there. We should have this conversation, get insight. What do we need to do? Stephen, I want to thank you very much for your time so far, because you've really, I mean, you are a very major force in this industry. People listen to you. So yeah, keep on sharing your thoughts to this world. Well, that technology is going to help us big time. Look at AI for good, but we need to maintain a grip on it. So thank you for your insights and your views on that.
Well, thank you, Fritz. And I say to the audience, follow Fritz.